Today, we are talking about disability in the ancient world, how Greeks and Romans thought about damaged or different bodies, who was cared for and who slipped through the gaps. My guest today is Professor Christian Laes, Professor of Ancient History at the University of Manchester. He has spent much of his career reconstructing the lives of people who are usually pushed to the margins of classical history. Children, young people, and those whose bodies or minds did not fit the ideal. His books include Children in the Roman Empire, Youth in the Roman Empire, Disabilities and the Disabled in the Roman World, and most recently, Disability and Healing in Greek and Roman Myth. Together, they have helped to put disability firmly on the map for ancient historians. Professor Laes, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
I thought we should probably, before we get started and getting really into the details of this, I thought it might be interesting for the listeners to hear how this all started for you. How did you first get interested in disability and antiquity as a research field?
Good question. So in preparing this interview, I sort of noticed that my first publication on the topic dates back to 2008, which was in Arctos, a Finnish journal. And there I basically explain how I came to the topic. So it's not a secret at all. Basically, one day I was teaching Herodotus to some undergraduate students. And Herodotus mentions the case of a certain son of Croesus, the Lydian king, and this son's name is not ever mentioned, but it turns out that he could not speak and presumably also not hear. And there is that one instance where Croesus explicitly says, "I count him to be no son of mine." So he would basically say, "I only have one son," while in reality he had two sons. And I remember when we were discussing this text that one of my students said, well, this is actually exactly the same thing as I recognize it going on in present-day Albania. So he had family living in Albania. And he said people there would say, we have 4 children, while in fact they have 5 children. And they don't mention the one disabled child which is there in the house. On the other hand, and that is very clear also from the Herodotus text, this does not mean that his family, that the parents did not care about the so-called disabled child. And said my student, well, this is actually pretty much the same also in Albania, because we always think that this points at a sort of neglect, but it doesn't need to be the case. So there is a sort of cultural silence about certain topics, but that doesn't mean that these people are necessarily neglected. And I thought, well, this is an interesting parallel. Would that have been research already for antiquity? And I found out that there were not too many studies. My PhD actually was about children in the Roman Empire, so this was kind of a logical step from children to children with disabilities, and that's how I kind of, by coincidence, fell into this topic, which has kept me busy for more than 15 years now already.
What have been the main difficulties in doing this kind of research?
Well, I think the central issue is always terminology. So I will always tell people that there is no term that, no ancient Greek or Latin term that actually matches our disability. It is just not there. But the same counts for a theme like sexuality. There is not one word in ancient Greek or Latin saying sexuality, let alone a thing like homosexuality. There are no precise terms for this in ancient Greek and Latin, and the same counts for disability. But still, of course, there were people who experienced a sort of disability as we know it nowadays. And so this is always the interesting thing in research like this. So there's the continuity thing, because we share human bodies. There must have been something like this in the past too, but on the other hand, the conceptual thing, which points to change, which points to different terms. So I would say it all comes down in the first phase to studying the vocabulary, the terminology.
This actually reminds me of the Eskimos who, because they deal with snow very often all the time, they have these many words for snow. Maybe even today we don't have as many words for disability as might reflect
Mhm.
the kinds of disabilities there are. We use one word in this kind of very broad way, but they really mean very different things.
Yeah, it became an umbrella term, as they call it now, and I like the parallel very much with the Eskimos you mentioned. So of course there's something like snow, and in all different cultures, well, this snow is somehow white, but then the way you approach it, the way you will call it, the different categories you will distinguish, well, these can all be very different from one culture to another.
So following from that, in the ancient world, illness was probably maybe more common, in our modern conception of illness, probably more common than not. Yeah. From minor diseases, parasites, to more extreme versions of illness. At what point would someone in the ancient world, if they did at all, kind of separate someone out to say, that's kind of beyond the standard illness and is something that we would conceptually now call disabled?
Yeah, I think there's two things I would like to focus on. So first of all, you mentioned standard, okay. People would sometimes also mention normalcy or the idea of normal, and that's the first thing I should say. There is no word also in Latin or ancient Greek to say normal, because normal often refers to norms, which in our present day thoughts often go together with numbers, statistics. So once you deviate from the statistic, once you sort of score a certain number in the statistics, well, this is not normal anymore. Yeah, and that sort of thinking is just not there in antiquity, because they couldn't define all these different illnesses or whatever with numbers as medical science does it nowadays. The other term, which is really important, I think, is the sort of expectation that a disease, an illness, an affliction is going to be everlasting. So in my view, the idea, that is the thing that comes closest to our disability concept. People realized also in the past that a certain condition was just not going to go away anymore, that it would be there permanently. And in this case, they viewed it as something different than, well, having a cold or a fever, just a normal, what they would call nosos, illness in Greek, or morbus in Latin.
And would that might include even parasites and other kinds of things that we might not nowadays see as a disability because they're curable, but maybe in the ancient world?
You're very right there too. So incurability is also a very important concept. What about, for instance, healing of fractures of bones? So of course medical doctors had quite a good knowledge, but who could go to doctor? And so when your fracture is not properly healed, this will somehow impair you for the rest of your life. So that also plays a role. So the idea of incurability, and I'm quite convinced that by sort of gut feeling or just instinct, they felt that some conditions were just going to be there for the rest of the life.
When you talk to people today about your research, what are the first things they imagine? What are the kind of immediate misconceptions that before you start you have to say, let's get this out of the way?
Okay, so there has been research just on the conceptions of disabilities, quite interesting. So first of all, when you mention to people that you study disabilities in the past, the first connotations always seem to be being in a wheelchair. Then the aspect of being blind and being helped by a guide dog or whatever, and then Down syndrome. So don't ask me why, but this seems to be a connotation that people often make when you mention disability. And so what I always tell them is what I told you already. Please be aware that terminology and approaching things in the past, in the ancient past, was very different from our approaches.
So maybe that tells us more about ourselves than it does about the ancients.
Absolutely, isn't that always in historical research? I think it's always also kind of a mirror for the researcher or for ourselves. Absolutely.
So if we switch that around, the way the Romans and the Greeks conceptualized bodily and mental differences, did they occupy a similar category, or were they seen as two very different kind of things? The kind of the mental aspect and the kind of physical side.
Yeah, this is a huge question, of course. I think that mostly they would see somatic, so bodily influences, also in the mental. So there wasn't really that sort of sharp distinction between the mental and the bodily, which is something which really comes in Western culture from Descartes on. So this distinction they basically do not make it, which means that also for mental disabilities or mental conditions, they often thought of remedies which we would nowadays call pharmaceutical or even chemical remedies. So that was there.
It's got another example of how our conceptualization is so pervasive that I didn't even consider that those things might not be seen as two distinct and as in sort of one together. As a historian, does it help you to distinguish between these various categories of disability?
Yes, because in a way you need categories for your hands-on approach. If just very simple, if you want to structure your book or whatever, well, it just helps to distinguish between different afflictions. So that's why the very first book I did on the topic, which was actually an edited volume, that book was called with the subtitle A Capite ad Calcem, which is Latin for from head to toe. And, well, yeah, it basically helps just to distinguish between what we would call mental afflictions, then the ears, the eyes, the mouth, then going to the body, the legs for mobility, and then other so-called disabilities. This is, by the way, also the method used by anthropologists when they want to study disabilities with certain peoples. They will often go for this categorization, as I just mentioned it. So just to make things, well, just to have a sort of structure, because otherwise, where will you start and which chapter will be there? So I think this is a practical thing to do.
So when young people today are encountered with these things, we say that they imagine people in wheelchairs.
Mm-hmm.
In the ancient world, wheelchairs didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Can you discuss a little bit about the ancient world's relationship with prosthetics and general ways that they try to manage?
Well, this is a topic I got very much interested in, but I should first of all mention that the great book on this, so Prosthetics in Antiquity, has been done by Jane Draycott from the University of Glasgow. So indeed, this spontaneous association between disabilities and, let's call it, supportive technology. I think that there, people in antiquity had much more kind of hands-on approach on matters. So indeed, there were no wheelchairs. There surely wasn't any production of wheelchairs. But of course, they realized that it could help that a disabled person, someone who had issues with mobility, was put on a cart. Yeah? And of course, they realized that, and you have attestations of this. So there were all sorts of practical measures they took without systematically applying them.
Would that explain some of the reasons why? Because I was thinking that there are ramps in some of these sanctuaries, and I was thinking, well, if there are no wheelchairs, why are there ramps?
Yeah, it is anyway easier also if you have to carry a person, or you would put him or her on a cart. It's easier to have a ramp, of course. So ramps have been very much discussed. But again, there's this beautiful article, I think, by Debbie Sneed, who really has made this point. Well, why would there be ramps? So it's not. We have no textual evidence for this, so it's not 100% sure. It's very difficult to make this point like a sort of definitive thing you really know, but I think it's a possibility that these ramps really helped for accessibility for who because that is also a problem. Who was supposed to have access to a sanctuary? A sanctuary is never like a Christian church, of course. It's only for temple servants, priests, and so on and so on.
Maybe something we can circle back to in a second. Could you maybe explore a little bit the difference, if there is any, between a prosthetic leg and legs made of wood, which is something I think you discuss a little bit in some of your...
I do in a recent article of mine, and I'm basically supported by the book that I mentioned already by Jane Draycott. So I would say that a prosthetic leg puts much emphasis on the technology. So prosthesis is something additional, something that is put there as a sort of extra. So prosthetic leg would mean that you put emphasis really on the technology. While the other thing, the leg of wood, basically means that it is viewed as a leg and it turns out to be of wood. So that would be the sort of subtle difference. And we know from grave offerings that people every now and then use these prosthetic legs or legs of wood.
So if it's not about the technology and it's more about the effect it's having, then people or animals are also part of that.
Yeah. There is an article on the supposedly first blind dog or guide dog in history, and in that article they refer to a fresco from Pompeii, which is very vague. So it's not really possible to find out what is depicted there. But it might be a poor man, a beggar, whatever, with a dog. And some have said, well, maybe this man is sort of searching his way, so he might have been a blind man. Who knows? I think in the medieval records there's some explicit attestations of blind people being helped, supported by a dog. As concerns antiquity, we have not found any such text. So people think it's in an epigram by Martial, but it's absolutely not true. So this is more like a reference to a dog, meaning a cynical philosopher, and poverty and blindness, but doesn't have to do anything with the blind dog. But there is some evidence on so-called disabled people being assisted by animals. So in the life of in one of the lives of Homer, and Homer was supposedly blind, it says that he actually walked around while leaning on the backs of sheep. Yeah. So it's not that these animals were trained for it, but at least he knows that he can follow the herd of sheep. There's also some possible references to little monkeys helping you, which again is a practicality of life. So this can be the case. So you could use these animals, but again, this was never done in a sort of systematic way. So every now and then they realized that the animal could help you. I'm now thinking of the most famous example, perhaps, of a mobility impaired individual in antiquity. So one of the speeches of Lysias, so brings us to 4th century Athens, and there it basically says, an individual just says, well, I need to use a donkey. I need to ride a donkey because otherwise I just cannot move around.
Systematically, it wouldn't make as much sense to train dogs, especially in the Roman period. Is that possible because of the access they had to human labor and slavery?
Mm-hmm. Again, might be, and it depends very much on your social class and your wealth. This is sometimes called a topos in literature, but it's absolutely true. Of course, if you for instance, as a blind person, if you would not have any family, and if you don't have any wealth to buy slaves or servants or whatever, well, this must have been like a horrible condition of living, absolutely. While on the other hand, if you have a certain financial comfort, of course you can buy servants or people to support and help you.
Would this to some degree explain why there wasn't really an industry for prosthetics or a classification? Because for those who had means, it wasn't necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And if you didn't have means, there wouldn't be an industry to be created.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good summary. Absolutely. And it's also the case, but you need to ask disability historians of other periods for this. But once you have, so from the beginning of the 19th century, once you have nation states, the nation state really wants to take care of all its citizens. And the idea also is that all citizens are part of a sort of healthy body, which is the state. So if you don't belong to this healthy body, you need to be helped by this state. And therefore, of course, there will be production also of all sorts of utensils to help the disabled. But this is really what historians of the more contemporary history have called the invention of disability, which brings them, there's a book about this, at around 1840. And then, of course, there's this industry also of all sorts of technological tools and instruments to help the disabled, which for the reasons you mentioned, thank you for this, was simply not there before.
Following on directly from that, before humans were in cities, we were part of small communities, and the community would look after those weaker ones if they were to survive. And that's what made humans so successful. Mm-hmm. Like you just said, in the modern nation state, this kind of community, in a way, aspect was reintroduced. But in that period in between, in those many thousands of years, what happened to you if you were disabled? Were you just left to die on the side of the road?
Mm-hmm. Not at all, I guess. But I'm grateful that you mentioned community and the community concept. This is interesting. So some historians of the ancient world have said, well, look at this. These so-called disabled people were much more integrated into society. They were part of the community. They worked. They participated in the labor process. How can we know? Well, because we have quite some osteological finds where you really see people who must have suffered, who must have faced difficulties, mostly mobility issues, but from whose bones it is clear that they have worked an awful lot during their lives. I mean, physical labor. Okay, so that is true. But this is not always necessarily a positive thing, because sometimes it was also the case that you just had to do it. No matter how stressful and painful it would have been, you just had to do it because there was no other solution. As relates so-called mental disabilities and being integrated into the community, the society, this is a very intriguing question, because first of all, often you don't notice the mental disability from the bone evidence. Nevertheless, there have been cases, and just in preparing this interview, I was sent an article which recently appeared in a Bulgarian journal, where there's some bones of people. They describe some bones of people who were victims of an earthquake, and it appeared from the bones that one of the individuals who died in the earthquake was actually afflicted by a very, very rare congenital disease, which also causes severe intellectual impairment. But he's an adult, and he has always been there, and he was part of the people who died during this accident, namely this earthquake. But how was he regarded in society? Was he accepted? Did he work, and was he then, because of his disability, often bullied? Or did people not really notice his so-called disability? These are interesting questions of what I would call empathic history. So you can sort of work with different imaginative scenarios without ever coming to the very one truth. We often do not know. I've tried to do this once for an individual who lived close to Ostia in the 1st or 2nd century CE, and who had severe malformation of the mouth, which must have made it almost impossible for him to eat in a normal way, to consume food in a normal way. Possibly this was also related to some intellectual difficulties, but again, you notice from the bones that he was integrated into society and that he had worked and that he had lived up to, I think it was between 40 or 50 years of age, which means that he must have been supported by some people, which means also that by his labor he was part of the society. But how was his life? Was he just like a normal, just to use this word now, a normal guy in the working community, or would he have been frowned upon? We just don't know. So in that article, I try to play, if you want to, with different scenarios based on what we know from anthropological studies. And the funny thing, this is just an anecdote now, but I had proposed it for a volume, and the editors didn't want to have it. And then I sent it to a journal, which accepted it. And one of the comments of the journal was that this was very much like a Charles Dickens story. And I thought, well, I took this as a compliment, because if I want to read about sociocultural history, mentality of the 19th century, I pretty much like Charles Dickens. Though it is fiction, of course.
To some degree, this answers my next question, but it also opens up this idea where you've mentioned quite a bit of archaeological evidence, which sounds, at first glance, as the best place to look into this kind of thing. However, much of your work is on Greek and Roman myth. Can you explain the place of myth, history, archaeology in the study of this?
Well, I always tell my audience and my students that there's so little that we know of the ancient world that we really need to combine every single piece of evidence. So I'm not an archaeologist myself, but for the topic of disabilities, of course, I also integrate archaeology, for which I have to rely on publications. So I cannot, for instance, read bones. There's osteologists who do this, and I just have to rely on their results. Let that be clear. But in order to get a fuller picture, you really have to do it. Now, as relates mythology and archaeology, I would say that archaeology also includes the study of objects and artifacts. And of course, you have numerous depictions of so-called, again, what is it? Of so-called disabled gods. And these are things you can study. Or, which you can easily find if you just Google it, there's a wonderful project which is called the Votive Offerings Project. We literally have thousands of votives from antiquity, mostly from healing sanctuaries. And an interesting thing is, why would people, for instance, offer a little statuette, a little terracotta object depicting a foot? Maybe because they faced difficulties with mobility and wanted to ask for healing. We have numerous depictions, artifacts that depict the womb. So where these women, or perhaps men, asking for, well, pregnancy, offspring, children for their wives, or were these the women themselves who did this? What if your sacrifice would be the depiction of an eye? Is this because of the fact that you're actually having troubles with seeing? So yeah, I think that this is a real an opportunity that archaeological sources give us, an opportunity that we really need to grasp. This combined also with what is called landscape archaeology. What if you actually manage to locate a sanctuary? Okay, it's on this spot. How difficult was it to access this sanctuary? Is it on a hill, for instance? Was it quite steep? Then, if you would have like hundreds of feet or limbs being depicted, how could you imagine these people getting there, or would they have sent anyone else to do it for them? So the smell. How must the smell have been of this sanctuary? Was it cold? Was it a hot place? Was there water? Was there a means of staying over at night? And so on and so on. So these are all questions that archaeological sources every now and then can give an answer to.
Combining everything seems to be the way.
Yeah.
But in some way, myth appears more prominently than maybe medical writers or legal texts. Is there a reason why myth is so useful?
Sure, because myth is, of course, a polyvalent and I would say even an ambivalent thing. Who is telling myths and who is doing what with myths? So in my small book you mentioned, I strongly make this point in the first chapter. I actually say there is not something like one canonical version of the myth of Hephaestus or whatever. There's many different myths about Hephaestus, and you always need to take into account the context. Is this myth used in, for instance, a tragedy, or in a comedy, which would have a totally different result, and well, there might be a whole different concept behind it. Is this used in passing by an orator as a sort of anecdote? Is it used by a medical doctor? Is it referred to in a prayer, for instance? So there's all these different uses of myth, including myths that depict disabled gods or heroes.
So if we start to dive a little bit into these myths, can you introduce Philoctetes to those unfamiliar with him, and how he is used in some of your work on disability?
So Philoctetes, thank you, got a separate chapter in my Disability and Healing in Greek and Roman Mythology book with Cambridge University Press. Yeah. So to be short, Philoctetes is a Greek hero, Greek warrior, aristocrat who took part in the Trojan War, and because of the fact that he got a wound which sort of caused an incredible stench, which was repulsive to his fellow warriors, he was exiled to the Isle of Lemnos, which is basically also the island of Hephaestus. Interesting, because they both face a mobility impairment, Philoctetes, because of this wound. And so he's living there for years, in like total isolation. We would almost call it exile because of his, being not socially acceptable anymore. But then Philoctetes is also a great archer, and they needed his skill with the arrows just to be able to do the conquest of Troy. So at a certain moment, these aristocrats, these Greek leaders, need to go back to Lemnos and almost beg Philoctetes to go back with them and to continue the siege of Troy. And then there's all these very humane, I'd say, motives that come in. So then Philoctetes would say, "What is this? You did not need me. You have left me here, and now suddenly you need me, and you start flattering me, and you want me back." And there's all sorts of negotiations. And according to Sophocles, at a certain point, when the negotiations are not going that well, Philoctetes will say, and there's really these Greek words like, it hurts again, so my wound hurts. And then in the end, there's no mention of the wound anymore. And there's a whole mythology also of Philoctetes after the Trojan War. According to certain myths, he is even the founder of some colonies in south of Italy. And there's no mention at all anymore of any possible disability or impairment. So this is really an intriguing case, I guess, and maybe at some point in his life he must have thought, well, this is not going to go away, and I will be faced with this impairment for the rest of my life, and who knows, I will die in Lemnos, and then in the end, the thing is not there anymore. So he's like a perfectly healthy Greek hero and warrior afterwards.
It seems to me, as someone who is not very well versed in these myths, somewhat instructive as to how the Greeks would have treated their disabled. The fact that he was just cast on an island wasn't needed, and if he hadn't been needed, would have been left there. And that they only came to get him when they needed him. Does that tell us anything about their attitude towards?
Yes and no. It all depends on the situation. So I think the thing that really caused Philoctetes' exile is the embarrassment. So in this case, the horrible stench. Otherwise, well, there must have been thousands of so-called war veterans, and they basically try to make the best out of it. But here it's more like a social thing. So you don't want to have this man with this very bad smell just in your proximity. Yeah? So there might have been cases of exile or just not belonging to the community anymore. But on the other hand, as I mentioned already, that there's many cases also of belonging, just being part of the community. So it's always ambivalent. Yeah.
As is always the case with these things.
Yeah, often.
Can you also now introduce, you've mentioned him before already, Hephaestus.
Yeah.
Introduce him to those who might not know and how he fits into this.
Yeah. So Hephaestus, interesting again. I think if you would ask people on the street everywhere, could you think of one disabled god in Greek or Roman mythology, they will always come up with Hephaestus. The intriguing thing again is that there's so many different versions, and let me point this out first. In the iconography of Hephaestus, he's often depicted without any disability. So it's not that he's always depicted as a sort of disabled god. Not at all. The other thing is that the ancient writers very much disagree about the origin of this disability. So it's often mentioned that he had difficulties in walking, so a so-called limp, with a very unkind word is sometimes called like a crippled god. But what would that mean? Why? So there's one, the two versions, both are with Homer. So one version by Homer has it that he was actually congenitally malformed. Again, Homer doesn't use very kind or nice words here. And that because of this malformation, he was actually thrown by his very own mother, Hera, from the Olympus Mount. And that, in a sort of journey of after a journey of almost 24 hours, that he sort of fell on the island of Lemnos, which is an island with a volcano, and then he was raised and educated by the Cyclops, which are sort of monsters, and they are involved in the art of being a blacksmith, and the volcano, you see what's happening there, and so Hephaestus becomes a very skilled blacksmith too. So that's one story. He being exposed, thrown away in a way by his mother because of the disability. But then there's another story which basically says that he wasn't disabled at all at birth, but that this had come because of the bad treatment, we would now call it physical abuse, by his father Zeus. And so again with Homer, it will be the same son, Hephaestus, telling his mother Hera, "Please, mother, be careful. Do not provoke the anger of your husband, because the same thing might happen to you as had happened to me." This is pretty intriguing. It's the first instance in Western literature of what we would call physical abuse within a household. Robin Lane Fox has written on this too, and he will mention that Hephaestus tells his story about the maltreatment by Zeus, and that while doing so, he's just limping around in the banquet of the gods and offering drinks to the gods, and the gods are laughing at his limp, which is again interesting. So in one of the first depictions in literature of disability, there is this element of mockery, which is strongly there. On the other hand, that is a point I make in the last chapter of my booklet. On the other hand, you could also read the Hephaestus myth as an instance of empowerment. So he, the ugly, disabled, between quotation marks, god, he was married to a very beautiful goddess. And because of his craft, because of his work, he managed to live in opulence, in a palace. So he was really doing well. He was respected. He was visited by other gods, and in one version he's even married to Aphrodite, who is the goddess of beauty and sexuality too. And then, this is again the other side of the story, he's cheated on by Aphrodite, who has a relationship with Ares, the god of war, and then by his technical skills he managed to catch both lovers in a trap while they are in the bed making love. He just throws a net over them, a net which they cannot possibly loosen. So they're just trapped there, they're caught in the net, and then this is an interesting detail. Hephaestus invites the other gods to come and see the spectacle and to laugh at both lovers. This is what I always thought the story was, but, and this is the thing you should always do as an ancient historian, you should check your sources. So while writing the book, I just read through the sources again, and there's a very interesting detail. Not all the gods were invited, only the male gods, because the female gods should not see this spectacle of adultery between Ares and Aphrodite.
This idea of mockery seems to kind of come up again and again.
Mm-hmm.
What does this tell us about mockery's place?
Yeah, that they absolutely had nothing like what we would call politically correct humor. So they could be really very, very harsh and cruel in their humor. And this is all around ancient literature. So Cicero himself, when he writes advices for orators, he would say, well, it's very appropriate to laugh at certain physical difficulties of your political opponent. Where he mentions the case of an opponent of his who had what is called a gloitre, this goiter, and he says, well, it's the appropriate thing to laugh at this. You can use it against your opponent. It's eminently there also in stories about the Emperor Claudius. At the same time, and this has been pointed out already in 1995 by my good friend and colleague Robert Garland, these disabilities are always in the eye of the beholder, which means that they can be used against you in certain contexts, but in other contexts it seems as if they just do not matter. So again, very ambivalent. Sometimes you could be mocked because of a certain deficiency, and the other time it would not even be mentioned or noticed, perhaps.
Did the Greeks, to some degree, structurally tie their conception of skill and marginality and power on Olympus with disability? There seems to be some kind of pattern where magical powers or fantastic skill and marginality tend to come together.
Sure. We could think about the dossier of witches, for instance, witches who are often described as so-called old hags or whatever. So ugly elder women, but at the same time, they have a certain power. So there might be, this is very strongly the case also in so-called curse tablets, in deformity, there might be a strong power. Absolutely. Think about what anthropologists have called the evil eye, which is all around in the Mediterranean. Think about these curse tablets, which mention possible disabilities being inflicted on your often love rivals or love opponents. Well, they're described in great detail in these so-called curse tablets, and that exists, for instance, also for Roman Britain. So I'm just thinking of the hundreds of curse-led tablets as we found them in Bath. But also, for instance, in Gloucestershire, in a small place called Ewley. This has recently been published, but there's a whole range of these curse tablets, almost doing a sort of what we would call nowadays voodoo. So you, by sort of hurting the tablet, fixing a nail through it or whatever, you sort of hurt, you want to hurt your opponent. And, well, often disabilities are mentioned, going from impotence to blindness to not being able to speak anymore, and so on, which also testifies of a quite harsh and somewhat cruel society where aggressivity was really expressed in a quite open way. The idea that may my opponent bleed, may he pay with his life, or may he pay with his health because he has taken my girlfriend, because he has stolen my cloak. That's also a motive which often comes back in these tablets.
Is there a power comes first approach here that is maybe different after Christianity brings the sort of moral, the morality of compassion into kind of everyday life? Because this all seems quite vicious and power first approach.
Again, sometimes, absolutely, but already Aristotle will also write about the feeling of pity. When he reflects on tragedies, of course he realized that some people in the audience might strongly empathize also with the suffering they saw on stage. Now, I would say that this is really a question I'd like to study in the years to come, the way how Christianity actually makes a change here. Again, I would not ever say that Christianity was the first religion that introduced compassion towards these people. Not at all, as I mentioned. There has been compassion always already. But there is more, of course, this sort of moral requirement of you showing this compassion. And I think that most historians nowadays would agree that the so-called birth of the hospital is somehow related to the development of Christianity, let's say from the 4th century CE on. So this sort of charitable institutions, they seem to come up in late antiquity, and Islam obviously also has this requirement of taking care of others. So the Islamic tradition basically takes it over from some Christians that were in those days called heretics and that were sort of exiled more in the direction of the East. So there seems to be a sort of connection between charitable institutions, hospitals in Baghdad, and Nestorian Christians who basically came from Syria. So I think that is there have also been publications about whether you would find anything as homes for the elderly, homes for the blind, homes for so-called fallen women in late antiquity, in the Byzantine period, and indeed there are some indications of this. But again, we as ancient historians, we suffer really from one disability or deficiency, if you want to call it like this. That is, we often lack any statistics or numbers, and that is really difficult. So I once wrote an article on mental institutions, mental hospitals in late antiquity and the Middle Ages. So we can trace them down, but if you would ask me how big were they and how many people were actually helped or supported, I cannot tell you. I'm sorry.
Oedipus may be most famous for marrying his mother, but for those who don't know, introduce Oedipus's connection to blindness and disability.
Yeah, I think, again, in my Cambridge book, I use the Oedipus case, I would say, for mainly for two things. So first of all, also in the tragedies, we get lots of practical hints, practical information also about the way a blind person had to carry on with his life. So he will actually once call his daughter, Iocaste, like his walking stick, because he can only walk around because of his daughter. There's lots of indications about what it means to be blind, the terrible pain of not being able to see your beloved ones, for instance. And on the other hand, it should also be said that the sort of allegorical explanation of Oedipus's blindness, that is, well, perhaps he was sort of released from his guilt, from the mistakes he has made, and perhaps he could sort of understand things better because of his blindness, that this allegorical interpretation only comes up in late antiquity. So I would really want to make the point that the ancient myths on Oedipus's blindness mostly focus on the hardships, the suffering which has been there. Yeah?
Would you say that blindness is one of the more severe disabilities in the conception of the ancients?
Mm-hmm. I would absolutely say so. So I think I've called the chapter in my 2018 book on disabilities and the disabled in the Roman Empire, I think I've called the chapter, quoting an ancient author, so blindness, the worst of all evils. So this is a thing you also find with Cicero. And I think it's pretty intuitive. I do not think that anyone would sort of prefer or like to lose his or her eyesight. So this is, I think, very ingrained in human people. So we just want our eyes to be there, which opens all sorts of possibilities on studying the gruesome punishment of blinding your opponent, which you find every now and then in the Semitic tradition, so the so-called eye for an eye, limb for a limb tradition, but which comes in strongly in late antiquity and in Byzantine antiquity, because you were not, in the Christian context, you were not supposed or allowed to kill your opponent. But then you could kill him socially, of course, by taking away his eyes.
Eyes, sight, knowledge, these are all kind of somewhat linked. Is that a modern idea, or is that...
No, it's pretty much an ancient idea too. So they realized this very well. You have a certain tradition about some Stoic philosophers, where it is basically said that thanks to their blindness, they gained more insight, more wisdom. And there's also some jokes about this. Cicero will narrate the anecdote, the story about a philosopher who was actually getting blind, and he had many girlfriends, and they deplored the fact that their lover was getting blind. And then he said, "Ladies, why are you so sad? Don't you know that the night has many pleasures?" Which is sort of referring to darkness of the night, darkness of blindness. So they sometimes joked about it too.
Do you think that Oedipus was making some kind of allegorical point with his blinding? within this context?
As I said, I think this point, so the allegorical point is more made in late antiquity. So there you have some writers sort of reflecting on the Oedipus myth as far as I see it. So surely in the evidence from the tragedy writers, it is really more about the suffering, which is even worse, of course, with Oedipus, because it was self-inflicted, of course, as you know. So he makes himself blind for the evil and the transgression which he has done. By the way, as tragedy writers will point out too, not really intentionally or not by his own mistake, but just by ignoring oracles and thinking that he was somehow wiser than the gods. But of course he never intentionally killed his father or married his mother.
You mentioned the idea of like a human being being a walking stick.
Mm-hmm.
To what degree are slaves and dependents and family members involved? To what degree was it seen as something that you personally wanted to be, like, as a family member attending to, or something which was equally well done by someone who was a slave or a prosthetic? Or
Yeah, I think when it is a family member, surely when we're speaking about the privileged classes, he or she would absolutely be regarded as an individual. So when Oedipus is mentioning his daughter, he's not saying you are only a walking stick. He says you are, as it were, my walking stick. Now, as for enslaved individuals, this is interesting. Of course, in my last publication on this, I mentioned Pliny the Elder, who had, because of his obesity and presumably also because of an illness which could have been asthma, he had difficulties in walking around. And so there's the famous story about him wanting to see the eruption of the Vesuvius, and then he dies on the beach, suffocated. Okay. Pliny the Younger will mention how Pliny the Elder was accompanied by slaves. He dies. Where are the slaves? They're not mentioned. So they will have been suffocated, I guess, together with their master, but they're not even mentioned. What about these ancient authors that mention difficulties with their eyesight, difficulties in reading or writing? Yeah, slaves do it for you. They read aloud, they write, but they are hardly ever mentioned. There's a very recent book by Candida Moss, and she deals with the enslaved writers, that is copyists also, of the Gospels. All these pieces of literature must have been produced, or no, not produced, but copied by writers who were often enslaved, and therefore hardly mentioned.
Is this because somehow the personhood of the slave, especially in the Roman world, became subsumed under that of the master?
Absolutely so. So Roman legal writings would call a slave an instrumentum vocale, which means an instrument, a tool that speaks. So this is one of my new research projects. I'm working now on the Aesop novel. This is obvious. So they, of course, understand that it's often difficult to deal with a slave in your house, because he or she might be much more clever than you. He might cheat on you. He might steal things. Have all sorts of silent resistance. So they knew that it was difficult and that sometimes there might be feelings even between the owner and the slave. Why not? But on the other hand, technically, he or she was always an instrument, an instrumentum. And there's that tension which you sometimes also find in literature.
Yeah, I mean, Aesop's Fables are one of those places where you see a real fear, in a way,
sure,
of the slave and how it could subvert the family, which I think as far as I understand, it was later used in more modern times as one of the arguments against slavery.
Of course, absolutely. So I think the best article on the Aesop novel so far is by the late Cambridge ancient historian Keith Hopkins, and he will compare the sort of humor which is used there in the Aesop novel to the humor you would have. Well, nowadays it would be even more contemporary about having, for instance, a robot in your house, which is AI steered and directed. Okay, so you have the thing and it can say nice words to you and it can manage to do all lots of things, but then it can get out of control and then people will blame you. They would say, well, you haven't done the right thing and so on and so on. But then it goes wrong and it can go seriously wrong. That sort of humor which you would have now about you buying this robot, this sophisticated robot, and it all goes in the wrong direction. That sort of humor is the humor used in the Aesop novel, I believe.
Maybe another interesting discussion for the
that
future.
Would be another podcast, though somehow related, because interestingly, Aesop in the first chapter is described as a disabled individual, not being able to speak, but then later on he gets healed by the goddess Isis, and he's also described plainly as deformed, ugly, small of stature, and so on and so on. So it's basically all there too.
To what degree can you talk about the difference between the aesthetic side of disability, maybe like having a false eye or a way of covering up a disability and dealing with disability, and the functional side, the difference?
Yeah. Okay. I would say that the aesthetical side, the coping with your infirmity, disability, or the not accepting of it, that is basically the red thread through the humor of Martial. So Martial, who is a 1st century Roman poet, wrote in Latin, and he has like 12 or 13 books of epigrams, so short humoristic poems. And when I still was in Brussels, so my first PhD student actually worked on the topic of deformity in Martial's epigrams. So again, Martial will use a lot of what we would call politically incorrect humor, but it is not really the case that he is laughing, that he is mocking these disabled individuals. He is more mocking those who cannot accept their own disability and want to hide it in a sort of what he calls silly way. So for instance, people not accepting the fact that they are losing their hair and then just making use of wigs. That is a typical thing. People losing their teeth and then just wanting to have like false teeth. Sort of motive that often comes up with Martial also is the elderly prostitute who cannot accept her own aging body, and she just wants to hide that she's getting older. So that kind of humor you will find, and behind this might be a sort of stoic thinking too. So the idea that your body is actually only an indifference, as they call it in Latin, something which doesn't really matter too much. And as a stoic, you should just overcome these little bodily difficulties. And you should be part of the ratio, of the logos, of the whole world, and so on and so on. So you can make all sorts of arguments about this. But I think that this is behind this mockery of people who want to hide their disability, use perfume, for instance, use all sorts of makeup in order to hide stains on the skin, and so on and so on.
Still quite a relevant kind of split in people's thinking today.
Yeah, of course. You should think about this. This is also a culture where nudity is quite a common occurrence. Think about the bathhouses. So everyone can basically see your bodily difficulties, stains, whatever. There is some literature with ancient medical doctors about circumcision and people wanting to reverse it, and which can be done, and this might be related to sort of mockery that could happen in the bathhouse. Where else?
This is something I think that comes up in the Jewish tradition with the Greeks introducing gymnasiums.
Yeah, absolutely. So it has to do with the gymnasium, which also has a nakedness, nudity all around, of course.
If you could pick one Greek or Roman myth that involved disability and healing that you think would be most relevant to a modern clinician or policymaker to read today, which would maybe help them rethink some modern assumptions about disability or in some way enlighten their view, where would you direct them?
A case that has been studied quite often also by medical doctors is the intriguing case of the Emperor Claudius. What was going on there? We basically don't know, but you notice in the biography by Suetonius that already from his childhood he was kind of behaving a bit strangely. So we would say nowadays, the royal family, the imperial family, didn't want to have him too much in public. So even when there were amphitheater games, circus games, whatever, they would make sure that his appearance wasn't too clear to the rest of the audience. The ceremony for getting his toga of becoming an adult, so the toga virilis, was done secretly at night, so was not a public ceremony at all. So that is there. He only had a few friends. His grandmother says that he's a sort of a mistake of nature. Can you imagine? And doesn't like him at all. And there are even private letters in the imperial house saying, well, you can't imagine him becoming an emperor someday. On the other hand, Emperor Augustus saw that this young guy had qualities. He supported him. And we know that he was intellectually actually very bright. He studied the Etruscan language, published about it. And there are some instances where we actually see that he gave a speech and that he did quite well. And then what about the stuttering? That, if you Google Claudius, so he's always in the sort of top 10 of famous stutterers in the world. But if you read the sources carefully there, it says that he was not in control of himself and of his words when he was in anger, which is basically not the same as what we would clinically call a stutter, not at all. There's also some indications of movements which were not bodily movements, which were not always like in control, so sort of a twitch or whatever. Okay, so medical doctors have proposed all sorts of diagnoses. I would say that these retrospective diagnoses only help to a certain point. So there are some scenarios that we might imagine, but on the other hand, I think it's much more important to see how Claudius functioned socially and how his possible impairments were depicted. And part of the negative tradition about Claudius has to do with the fact that Seneca, who was the educator of Prince Nero, who became his successor, of course, that the great philosopher Seneca did not like Claudius at all. And he will write this famous treatise, I will try to pronounce it in Latin, or the Greek title is Apokolokyntosis, which means the pumpification of Claudius, where he actually mocks Claudius after his death, and where he sort of depicts him as going to the gods and there being mocked. He becomes like a sort of clown on the Mount Olympus, and every single god will laugh at him. But this is really in the context of personal invective. So your political opponent writing about you after you're dead when you could not do anything anymore. And I think this is such a really intriguing case, because on the other hand, so he married 4 times. He didn't always choose the right wife, perhaps, but well, he had an active marital life. He had children, and as an emperor, he actually did really well. He was successful. There was the conquest of Britain, of course, but also some social measures, so integrating equestrians more in the Roman Senate. So I think he was one of the more successful emperors. And I always recommend my students, I always tell them, well, this has been produced and filmed before I was born, can you imagine? But the I, Claudius BBC series is still wonderful. If you see the performance of Derek Jacobi, he really, well, he does it in a brilliant way. So you notice that Claudius has some difficulties, absolutely, but he also has that mental strength.
As is quite common when you become an expert in a topic, certain things that people do or say about the topic in ignorance can become a little bit of a bugbear. Is there something in this topic which is something you would try to, you'd wish that other classics or historians would stop doing or saying?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. Thank you for this question. So I think, and this is basically absolutely true from the standpoint of human rights. So some disability historians would say, well, I study disabilities because this can be very relevant for present-day society. And this says something about inclusion and so on and so on. So let me be very clear, I'm all for inclusion, absolutely. But for me, this is more a matter of human rights. I do not basically need the dossier of antiquity for this. So I study this because it says so much about what I'm interested in, society in antiquity. So I think it's a very, very relevant theme just for everyone doing social cultural history. It is about marginalization, integration, about differences between our views, contemporary views, and ancient views. But I would never ever study this just to make a case for disability activism nowadays, which is a useful and valuable thing to do. But again, my point would be that you don't really need antiquity for this. And I know that some will disagree on this, absolutely.
If you could have one new piece of evidence, one cache of letters or sanctuary archive or set of medical notes, what kind of single find would most transform our thinking about disability and antiquity?
I would absolutely love to have testimonies of people having watched Jesus' miracles. That would be wonderful. So, for instance, the man mentioned in the Gospel of John, who was congenitally blind. So it's stated explicitly that from childhood on he did not see. And then he gets healed after this conversation. Jesus saying, look, this man did not commit any sin, neither did his parents. What about the bystanders? They must have gone to rabbis, and rabbis could have said, well, this is a fake miracle, or is this a real miracle? Have we seen this before? What about this man? This is never mentioned in the Gospels, of course. Let's say 1 year later. Could he still see, or was this a sort of eye infection that had always been there and it got better, but then afterwards things got worse again? We do not know. So, reports by bystanders, that must have been, that really looks like me, that would be like a unique source, but it's so hard to find out. So I think there's a joke about, I would need to check it, but I'm almost sure that it's Vespasian, so Emperor Vespasian. It's he. And he makes jokes about him becoming a god and about his capability of performing miracles. Miracle is an intriguing topic for the study of disabilities.
Well, another sort of rabbit hole for a podcast, the whole miracles in the ancient world.
What does it mean when Jesus is called when Jesus says that no one is a prophet in his own country, and then the Gospels explicitly say that in his own region he was only capable of laying hands on people, but he could not perform any, translations say miracles. The Greek has dynames, which are powers, powerful things. Actually, I have an article forthcoming on this. I just saw the last proofs, but it will be out very soon. So really, what do miracles in the Gospels say about concepts of disability or not?
This is a really interesting crossover with a previous podcast I did with Professor Peter Pullman, because I asked him this question about the idea of miracles and miracle workers. People clearly went to them, and they worked. They worked often enough for it to be a legitimate avenue of exploration. And to some degree, the placebo effect is at play. But Professor Pullman says placebo effect is just another word for we don't know.
I would absolutely. So we had many. So Peter Pullman and I had, as you can imagine, many conversations about this already. Yes, I would agree absolutely. So the placebo says it all, and it says nothing at the same time. So that is obviously true. What could I add to this? I firmly believe that. From a sort of gut feeling, they sort of realized that some things were just utterly impossible. For instance, this is a discussion that goes all the way into the Middle Ages. The miracles of Jesus Christ and of the saints are somewhat unexpected, but they are not against nature. So there's all discussion about kataphysin, which is just following nature. Paraphysin would be against nature. Let me give you two obvious examples. There's not one single miracle of a person of small stature, what was often called a dwarf, suddenly growing. That just doesn't exist. There is no instance of an amputated limb or a limb which has never been there, suddenly growing. That is not there. Of course, you might mention Jesus, who puts the ear back of the soldier whose ear was being chopped off by Peter. But that is not exactly the same thing. Could be about a wound that is just in some way or another healed. But I would say like the growing of a small person, it's not there. Growing of limbs are not there. And there is actually a joke which you read in one of the Greek inscriptions about someone without eyes, so with empty eye sockles, going to the sanctuary and returning with eyes. But this is a joke, I think. I think it refers to prosthetic eyes, because it doesn't say that he sees. So that would be, I think they would realize that is just impossible, which is reflected by the term paraphysin, so really against nature. And also from a theological point of view, you would not expect God to do anything which goes against his own creation. I've done a long chapter once on what is called in literature nowadays intellectual disability. So things which are there congenitally, mostly by birth, and you just notice that there is there are difficulties with intellectual development, very severe learning disorders or whatever, and also there's not one instance of such an individual being healed, and we have to wait till Paracelsus, 15th century, before there's someone explicitly saying this. Well, Jesus and the saints do not do this because this is just impossible. The ancient term for this would be, again, between quotation marks, obviously, a naturally born fool. So someone who was, the Greek has moros, the Latin has stultus or fatuus, ec genees, ex nativitate, so from birth on. So they realized that there were some conditions which were basically incurable, and I'm sure that Peter Porman would agree that these cases were not considered to be cases for doctors, because if it's incurable, what would you do as a physician?
It's a really interesting distinction.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who inhabits the ancient world, what would you, if you had to guess, what future historians would say, looking back at our time and how we conceptualize disability or treat disability? How do you think, do you have any perspective that is slightly outside?
I think I've published about this once already. So I think if people with a time machine or whatever would come to our present day society, that they would be astonished by all categories we distinguish in social disabilities. Yeah. They would say, what is this, like extreme shyness, for instance, or you not wanting to go out and interact with people? They would say, well, this is perhaps something strange, but they would not ever call it a disability. Same counts for, so I think you should interview a psychiatrist for this, but same counts for all the learning disorders. Of course, I would not ever deny that these exist, but we tend to distinguish so many different disorders now that it sometimes gets almost out of hand. And after 10 years, a psychiatrist would say, well, no, this was perhaps not the right category, which we have to call it, we have to label it differently. And so I firmly believe that if you would transfer a Roman to our days, he would say, well, what is this? Why is this ever considered a disability? It's just, a fact of life. It's something which is there. Maybe. So the whole discussion about diagnosis, of course.
Maybe this comes back somewhat to the Eskimo thing again about different words for snow.
Yeah. But it's also very much related to our society, because when you are diagnosed with a certain disability, whatever, there might be compensation for this. Yeah? And there might be support, which is, let me be clear, very good, of course. But if there is a society which anyway doesn't offer this support, then perhaps there might be less of a tendency of having these different categories. Another thing would be, this is so difficult also to study, identity. Again, there is no Greek or Latin term to say identity. So would someone in the ancient world consider himself as member of the disabled community? That is so difficult. Nowadays this is getting much more easier because you have the internet. You find communities for everything. And again, this can be a very good thing because you can find a support with people living in Australia, in Canada, in Africa, everywhere in the world. And you sort of see that you go through the same things, and then you form a community, and you could say, well, we are the, I don't know what, and that is our identity. But that sort of thinking, only for practical reasons, could not have existed in the ancient world. And I would say in all of the pre-modern world.
That's really another fascinating angle, really. Two things. One is the kind of subdivision of various difficulties in life that can become identities, but then also, both because of the financial side of it, but also because of the way that modern medicine is, where they get a name. But because we just have this kind of one category of disabled, very often very disparate kind of conditions, which maybe shouldn't even be within the same universe or category. Because we only have this kind of very limited vocabulary to talk about these things, all fall under this big umbrella. But actually, we're dealing with a much more diffuse and interesting differences.
I couldn't phrase it in a better way. So our evidence really is much more diffuse. Yeah, I would agree.
Your work ranges from childhood and youth to sexuality and disability across the Roman and late antique worlds. looking back, is there any thread you can see that ties all your interests together?
This is a good question. People often ask me this. Yes, definitely. I just like the encounter with people of other cultures. So in my free time, I'm a traveler too. So I just like to explore new countries, new regions, and I'm always interested in people. By the way, also in contemporary issues, and preferably I take contemporary issues to the ancient world. So I would say that the red thread really is this encounter. I've basically always studied human life course, going from indeed early infancy, childhood, over youth, old age, disabilities, marriage, sexuality. So these are things, when you encounter people of a different culture, you're often interested, I at least, in how they deal with these daily life things. And so this is just my passion to do this for the ancient world. And of course, I love studying languages. And well, the way to access these people from the ancient world for these themes is mainly through the languages. So it's basically perhaps just an apology for the fact that I want to read lots of sources in ancient Greek and Latin, including inscriptions, which is also one of the things I like to focus on. So inscriptions often come in when you study life course, and there is that idea of sort of direct access to these people, which needs to be put in context again, of course, but that direct access via a stone, reading a stone.
You've just opened up this idea in my mind where it's very fashionable for people to want to travel in space.
Mm-hmm.
They like to go to different countries and meet different communities and different people. But the idea of traveling in time is not seen as the same thing, but in some ways they have a very similar effect.
I think it sometimes has, absolutely. Yeah. It's all about encounters. So then you can, of course, travel in your mind, can't you? So then you can read books about different cultures, which is very fine too.
And so much more accessible as well.
Of course, you can now via the internet you can study whatever language you want and be in contact also with people who speak that language.
You spent a lot of time in your career defending the place of Latin and Greek in schools and universities. This is a topic which I think many contemporary people struggle to understand. Why is this a fight worth having for you? What kind of classics teaching do you think is still worth doing today? And for those who maybe missed it in school, what kind of classics is still worth doing if you're in your late 20s, your 30s, or maybe later in life?
Yeah, I won't make any promotion for any bookshop or whatever, but I just happened to be in one yesterday in Manchester, a huge bookshop, and I noticed to my great pleasure that every single year, I would say even every single month, there's new accessible books coming out about this ancient world, which for me really goes from ancient Mesopotamia up to very late antiquity, which might even include early Islam. So there's so many things being published, which really means that there is an audience for this. And then the question would be, of course, why? Why would you want to do this? So you can read these books as an adult. So why would you want to do this in secondary school or in university? I think a mistake that has often been made in, well, let's say in my home country, which is Belgium, that is that for a very long time, teachers just focused on the intellectual skills you acquire when studying classical languages. Of course, this is true. Sure, you will get linguistic skills of linguistic analysis. You will pay careful attention to close reading, all sorts of grammatical categories. That is all obviously true. But if you only focus on this, well, in all honesty, that would count also for a difficult contemporary language like, for instance, Russian or Icelandic. Most of these Slavic languages, by the way, have many cases. What about Arabic? Yeah? So there's so many. So the intellectual argument can be made for so many other languages. So I always say there should be more to it. It is, of course, about this intellectual formation, but it's also because of the fact that these Greco-Roman ancient worlds still matter up to today. And some people will say, well, this is very much Western oriented, but I really do not agree with this. I think that every single culture, in a way, has its classics. And I would not ever deny that, for instance, Japanese classics or Chinese or Korean classics are hugely important, of course. But that would be more for their world. And for our world, there is that sort of huge importance of Greco-Roman culture in the very wide sense of the word. I also very much believe that when you study Greek and Latin in the right way, that it always brings you to world history. There's a very recent book by Roderick Beaton on the Greeks. He calls it The Greeks. And he will say, well, this is actually a world history which brings you all over the Mediterranean up to Pakistan and India and even into the New World. And he basically covers Greeks from the Minoic Age up to Mitsotakis, up to nowadays. If you study the Roman Empire, well, this is huge already. If you study Latin language, this goes up to nowadays. I'm actually a passionate speaker of Latin too. Well, you will still find Latin poetry, let's say from Australia up to Canada, all over the world. So this tradition is there. So my first answer would be, it matters most for us. My second answer would be, by definition, it is sort of world history, world literature already. And I'm never ever pessimistic about the so-called survival of the classics, because if you think of it, this fight, as you called it yourself, this actually goes back to the 18th century already. So from the Industrial Revolution on, you will get this discourse like, look, we need more engineers, we need more people dealing with economy, we have factories now, why would you care about studying these old humanistic things? This is all old-fashioned. Well, this already exists in the early 19th century, and we're still there. So as one Manchester colleague once said, classics are always dying, but they never die.
Is it fair to say that classics is almost like the soul of Western civilization? As in, if you were to study in depth the ancient world and classics, it would give you an explanatory framework and a foundational framework for understanding contemporary ideas, morality, philosophy. And in some way, it's almost the soul. Yeah. And that if we just studied engineering, or we just studied, which are all very important, the foundational nature and character that defines the current Western civilization would in some ways be missing, and that we could equally have all of those skills, for example, in a Chinese culture, in a completely different context.
No doubt about this. Yeah. Yes, I think I would agree with this. So I would perhaps expand it a bit more. So to me, if you talk about which education do we need now, I would say, well, it needs to be really an education that gives proper attention to arts and literature. So for England, I would say you need to read the classics of English literature. You need to have a look at art history and so on and so on. So I would say that these things are all very important. Yeah, absolutely. And for antiquity, I would say framework is a good way to just summarize the whole matter. So, for instance, if one would claim you need to study 5th century BCE Athens because democracy, our modern democracy, was invented there, that is, of course, nonsense, because Athenian democracy is in no way the same as present-day democracy. But the framework is there. The idea that from the Enlightenment on, people use the Greek word demokratia to say democracy. The fact that they keep on referring to classical Athens as a form of inspiration, although they're doing things quite differently. That's another thing. But the reference already matters, as nowadays also, and already in the 19th century. So in America, the United States, you will get lots of references to the Roman Republic, preferably the Republic. Well, again, you can in no way compare the Roman Republic to present-day American democracy. But the fact that reference is made matters again. So this is really hugely important. And I would say that as a framework, we also always need to take into account Christianity combined with the Judaic tradition and combined also with the Islamic tradition. And basically, these monotheistic religions, they also arise, they come into being within this Mediterranean Greco-Roman world.
And all of this in some way is context for many
It's
things we take
context,
for
of course.
granted
Yeah.
that we may not think through.
Mm-hmm.
And they're assumptions, and many
Yeah.
times people don't think through the assumptions of the world they
Sure.
live in. And this is
Sure.
where those
Yeah.
assumptions are.
Yeah. But
their
assumptions have been
foundations.
around everywhere. So if I think about like real, let's say, classical approaches of the ancient world, courses on Roman Empire would sometimes not even mention Christianity, which is very, very strange, of course, because how could you ever understand Christianity and the figure of Jesus Christ without, well, of course, the Jewish background, but without the Greco-Roman background? That is just impossible. So we should always be aware that there are assumptions, and we need to take this broad view. And at the same time, I firmly believe that there is nothing wrong with using a word like framework, really as so the ancient world as a sort of framework to understand also our present-day society and culture.
This question might be somewhat morbid, but it's something I like to ask at the end of a podcast. If you had to look ahead from now until the end of your career, is there one or two big projects that you would like to see through before you eventually step back from active research?
So I still have quite some time left. Of course, so there's always dreams and new projects you want to realize. So I would like to, first of all, just continue this study of disabilities in the ancient world, but really focusing on late antiquity. Because in late antiquity, you get also in languages all these different traditions going from hagiography in Latin, hagiography in Greek, but also, for instance, for Egypt in Coptic. You get Ethiopian sources, Syriac, Aramaic, Armenian, Georgian, Arabic also. There's also Christian Arabic literature. And basically, these saints in hagiography are always sort of copying the miracles of Jesus Christ. But you get an awful lot of details in these saint stories which are never there in the, let's call it, classical sources. So that should be studied, and the whole idea also of whether disability was viewed differently when monotheism became so important. The idea of when my child has a disability and when there is only one God who by definition is good, how do I have to explain this? Is this a sort of, does this relate to sin? Is it my fault? Is it the child's fault? What is happening there? Or are there demons and some powers under God? Well, all these things matter. Also charity. So I think that there's lots of things to be said there, and things that really need to be studied. There's not one single big study of disabilities in late antiquity, and it would need a team, so a project of people who read all sorts of languages that I unfortunately cannot read. So that is a thing I'd really like to do in the future. And as you mentioned, I have like very broad interests. Another thing I'm thinking about is this brings us to the 19th and the 20th century. It's more than 100,000 Latin verses that exist. So in Amsterdam for almost 150 years there has been an international contest of Latin poetry, and just to this has partly been explored already, but to further explore this marvelous poetry and also bring this intellectual world in contact with the intellectual world of other literatures which was there in the 19th and the 20th century. I think this is a big project that we as Latinists have to achieve once.
Well, I know you are an incredibly busy man with a lot on your plate, so thank you very, very much for taking the time to talk.
It was
with
a
me
pleasure
today.
and an honor also to do this. So thanks for having me anyway.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.